No doubt we're all aware of the crucial role that the Soviet Union played in the post-World War II world order and the Cold War. It emerged from the Second World War as one of the two most powerful states in the entire world. But how did this happen? Where exactly did this new superpower come from? Could it be largely due to one man's decision? In his attempt to wipe the Russians off the map and seize their lands for Germany, is it possible that Hitler instead set off a chain of events that led to the Soviet Union's immense post-war power? Of course, by virtue of defeating Germany, which in turn had defeated the other continental European powers, it's no surprise that the Soviet Union emerged from the war as the sole power left on the continent. Yet, it was no mere survivor. Instead, something rather unexpected had taken place thanks to Hitler's unsuccessful invasion. The Soviet Union had emerged through unimaginable death and destruction to become more powerful than ever before. It didn't just manage to remain a power, or even a great power. It became a superpower. To try and understand why, let's take a trip back to the late 1930s. The Soviet Union and Germany signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact on 23rd of August 1939, which was a treaty of non-aggression. On 1st of September 1939, Germany invaded Poland, setting off World War II in Europe. The Soviets followed suit and also invaded Poland on 17th of September. For the next year and a half, Germany and the Soviet Union would expand in multiple directions, carving up Europe between them, but resisted facing off against each other. You can see on the map the state of Europe just before Barbarossa, with the Axis powers firmly pushing up against the Soviets. On the eve of Barbarossa, the German East Army was massed on the Soviet border with approximately 3 million soldiers, supported by 690,000 other Axis troops. They were equipped with 600,000 motor vehicles and almost 3,700 tanks. Facing them was the Red Army, which had a strength of around 5.5 million, although it was quite dispersed and not fully mobilized. On June 22, 1941, Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest military operation ever. To see what that looks like on a map of Europe, we can watch this short clip. So hopefully this provides some sense of the scale of what Germany unleashed and the dire situation that the Soviets were faced with. You can also see the number of soldiers involved as the invasion progresses. So this short clip only goes up to the end of September 1941, so it covers about 3 months of fighting. To try and get another sense of just how massive this conflict was, we can also look at this graph showing the initial number of soldiers facing off in Barbarossa compared to Russia's invasion of Ukraine earlier this year. We can see that Barbarossa was on a scale of several million soldiers from the get-go, while this year's conflict initially involved only a few 100,000 soldiers. We have only to kick in the front door and the whole rotten Russian edifice will come tumbling down. So said Hitler prior to invading the Soviets, some very bold words. Indeed, it seems that when push came to shove, the Germans kicked Russia's door down, but also ended up breaking both their own legs in the process. However, Germany did seem to get off to a great start. By the end of December 1941, the Red Army had suffered 1,750,000 casualties, while they had cost the German army 200,000 dead in return. While the momentum seemed to be in Germany's favour, the tide would eventually turn against them. While we won't go into too much detail, David Stahel provides some insight. While the shattering defeats suffered by the Red Army remain categorical, he writes, they were only achieved at a cost so great to the Wehrmacht as to quickly preclude any hope of final victory in 1941. And at no time succeeded in eliminating major Soviet resistance. On a certain level, the Soviet Union was simply too big to destroy, and had too many people with which it could meet the German onslaught. While the initial Red Army was by no means small, the Soviets were also in the process of calling up 14 million more men and women to fight when Germany invaded. The war in the East would drag on for almost 4 years, until 9th of May 1945. By that time, around 4 million German soldiers lay dead in the East, representing 80% of the Germans killed in World War II. Soviet losses are the subject of contention, with conventional estimates in the high 20 millions dead, with most of them being civilians. But some Russian scholars have recently suggested that as many as 40 million or more could have died in total. The true number will likely never be known. The war had some important outcomes for the Soviet Union, including its industrial capacity. At the outset of the invasion, requirements for new munitions and soldiers to replace early losses hugely exceeded initial plans, and the gap between needs and resources grew to unbearable dimensions. Informal leadership took over and carried out essential war mobilization. The most important measures were a program to evacuate munitions factories in the war zones to the remote interior of the country, and the total conversion of civilian industry to war production. Ultimately, the Soviet Union would outproduce Germany in all areas except for shipbuilding. Despite the fact that it was a war that Germany had planned, and that the Soviets were taken largely by surprise, Soviet industry was mobilized more rapidly than that of Germany. For example, in 1942, Germany produced 6,200 tanks and self-propelled guns, representing around 3 times as many as they had produced in 1940. Comparatively, the Soviets produced 24,700 tanks and self-propelled guns in 1942, which was 4 times greater than German production in the same year, and nearly 10 times as many as the 2,800 the Soviets had produced in 1940. Another key element in the Soviet victory, if not its post-war power, was the US Lend-Lease program. Between 1941 and 1945, the US provided over $11 billion worth of material to the Soviets, amounting to 14,000 aircraft and 13,000 tanks, among other equipment and materials such as rolled steel. Nikita Khrushchev wrote that Stalin frequently said that without Lend-Lease we could not have won the war, and I agree with him. And Soviet Marshal G.K. Zhukov similarly stated that the Americans shipped over to us material without which we could not have equipped our armies, or been able to continue the war. While these material effects are by no means insignificant, another powerful result of Barbarossa was what it did to the Soviet people and the Soviet Union's national identity, which continues to this day. The war has had a lasting impact in the lives of the Russian people. The shared trauma of the war contributed to national unity, helping to forge a common national identity and purpose. The political benefits of this persisted throughout the Cold War and are still visible today. Jade McGlynn, writing for Foreign Policy, states that Russian state actors use a selective history of World War II as a tool to remind the world of Russia's inherited right to the great power status earned by the Soviet Union in 1945. We can also turn to Putin's 2020 National Interest article, in which he discusses Russia's memorializing and remembrance of the war and illustrates, if not an unbiased perspective, then the power that Russia's World War II experience still has today. Why does one feel a lump rise in their throat? He says. The war has left a deep imprint on every family's history. There are fates of millions of people, their sufferings and the pain of loss. There is also the pride, the truth, and the memory. More recently, we can again see Putin discussing the war in his Victory Day speech from earlier this year, in which he says, "The defense of our motherland when its destiny was at stake has always been sacred. Today, as in the past, you are fighting for our people in Donbass, for the security of our motherland, for Russia. May 9th, 1945 has been enshrined in world history forever as a triumph of the united Soviet people, its cohesion and spiritual power. There is no family in Russia that was not burnt by the Great Patriotic War. Its memory never fades." While the application of these sentiments to the current situation in Ukraine is questionable, the Great Patriotic War narrative is very emotional, and I actually find myself quite moved by Putin's words. It's easy to see why the war continues to be a unifying memory which provides a wellspring of nationalist sentiment for political actors to tap into. The impact of Barbarossa and the resulting Great Patriotic War still loom large in the Russian national consciousness. While it's true that Russia was no weakling before Barbarossa, what Hitler did was force the Russian people at every level into an existential fight for national survival, which then provided them with a uniting national narrative to carry over into the Cold War and beyond. In his attempt to destroy Russia, Hitler put it through a traumatic and relentless forge, which turned it into a superpower instead. We have seen how several outcomes, initially generated by Operation Barbarossa, coalesced to transform the Soviet Union into a post-war superpower. First of all, they won the war. The German invasion also necessitated large-scale industrial growth and military production infrastructure, and also increased social unity and strength in the face of imminent national extermination. The nationally binding myth of the Great Patriotic War further serves to unify the Soviet Union and Russia today under a shared trauma and common history. The immense material support received from the US by virtue of being the last man standing in Europe should also not be understated. Finally, when all was said and done, there was a complete lack of any rival powers left in Europe, largely thanks to Germany. To be clear, the Soviet Union wasn't weak before World War II. Had Germany not attacked, the Soviet Union would still have been a strong contender on the world stage. But what Germany's invasion and the war in the East did was accelerate this growth in Russian power and capabilities, while also removing every one of its rival powers from the board, except for the United States. It is this post-World War II vacuum in Europe which facilitated the Soviet Union's ascension to superpower status. By attacking Russia, Germany succeeded only in inadvertently removing itself as a rival European power, after itself previously removing all other contenders, and so it created a geopolitical situation in which the Soviet Union was the only real power left. Ultimately, Germany's decision to invade the Soviets accelerated the creation of a bipolar world order and facilitated the Soviet Union's position as a superpower throughout the Cold War.